I want to welcome everyone to this course on feminism and social justice. I'm really happy to be able to do this today. And I want to give you a little bit of a substance about defining feminism and defining social justice. I have this working definition of feminism, which I started to write, I don't know, sometime in the 1980s. And then it evolved as the movement evolved and as issues evolved and as people developed ideas about what feminism should accomplish and what it should be about. So I'm going to read it in its entirety first, and then I'm going to break it down so we can talk about it in different component parts. So if you go to Merriam-Webster dictionary, actually any dictionary, and look up feminism, it will tell you that it's the theory of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. So you'll see right away here there's an assumption that there are sexes. And in the Merriam-Webster, in this kind of definition, sexes and gender are used interchangeably. So they're not talking about sex as in sexual sex, they're talking about sex as gender. But most of the dictionaries don't make that distinction. And the other thing I will say is the real question for us is, what does equality mean? It's very easy to say equality, and it's very hard to deconstruct what that means and how people are affected by it, and especially affected by where they are in society by gender, by which I mean male, female, trans, right? Different categories of gender, and where they are in terms of race, by which I'm talking about racial oppression and people of color, and then class, by which I mean economic situation. And so many people in the United States think of themselves as middle class, but in fact, they are working for a living. And so in another lexicon, for example, according to Marxist ideas, they'd be called working class. But a lot of people don't like to think of themselves as working class. They want to say, no, because striving to be middle class, okay? And then, so it has all of these components, all of these various components to it. And then sexuality. So again, with sexuality, we're talking about, well, I'm a lesbian, and some people are heterosexual, and some people are bisexual, and so lots of different possibilities. Some people are, I've heard the expression, pansexual. And so, but we talk about sexuality because there's an assumption in the power structure of the society that people are basically heterosexual. And unless people designate themselves, the default category, the norm, is always thought of as heterosexual. What I say, this evolving definition, is that feminism means that women shall have at least as much to say as men about everything in the arrangement of human affairs, including especially the meaning, purpose, and activities of their own lives. Then my next sentence is, feminism means the collective empowerment of women. For women of color in the United States, and indeed in the world, such a collective empowerment cannot be achieved unless the communities of which they are a part are liberated from all forms of racial oppression. So that's part of this intersectional idea. Likewise, women in the global South cannot achieve such a collective empowerment unless and until all aspects of colonialism and neocolonialism are eradicated. Well, that's a very tall agenda, right? And I'm going to come back to it and talk about it a little bit more, but that's a very tall agenda. In addition, women cannot achieve a collective empowerment without economic independence from men. Full and gainful employment and meaningful employment and education and training required for it, and freedom from poverty. Similarly, women's collective empowerment requires that women have control over their own bodies and all of the decisions affecting their reproductive capabilities, including access to choices concerning contraception, abortion, childbirth, and pre- and postnatal care. So I don't think of women's reproductive choices as only being about abortion. I think the primary thing is the right of women to bear children in safe and fully supported environments where they get prenatal care and postnatal care, where they have nutrition and access to any and all medical care that they might need, and also, importantly, access to midwives. And that's a whole other story. But likewise, women cannot achieve a collective empowerment unless they are free from all forms of violence and sexual coercion. In addition to rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, and related acts, in my definition, violence against women also includes war and preparations for war. And I put that in there because in wars, it is the civilian population. It's not that soldiers aren't killed, I don't mean that, but it's civilian populations that terribly suffer. If you think about the bombardments that go on all the time. And it's women and children who are basically killed in those, and terribly wounded and maimed and so forth, and terrified. Women's empowerment cannot be achieved unless and until women and men have absolute control of their own sexuality, the inalienable rights to choose their own sexual and loving partners, as long as this is between consenting adults, free from censure, reprisal, or any other form of discrimination. And both boys and girls must have access to a full curriculum of sex education, free from fear and with the fullest scientific accuracy and disclosure. Now, at various points in time, there's been censorship in the schools, and it also depends in the United States geographically about where you are. If you're in certain parts of a rural community, if you're in certain parts of the South or Southwest, you get less freedom of education, K through 12 is what I'm thinking about, of this kind of education. Feminism embraces the fluidity of gender and the right of people to pursue transgender identities and practices in accord with their propensities and wishes, free from all forms of discrimination, censure, and reprisal. Likewise, feminist purpose includes the use of pronouns other than he, she, to indicate a nonspecific gender designation. So I know many of my students now prefer or will ask me not to use the he, she, which is a gender binary, but to use another designation, they, that sort of collective pronoun, and other indications. Feminism is the complicated enterprise of achieving equality between women and men and among all peoples. Feminism is about the elimination of all forms of hierarchy, all systems of domination. It is about honoring the preciousness of all life in accord with cultural, legal, historical, and political understandings of gender. This definition uses specific designations of women and men, of racial and sexual identities, in order to appropriately recognize struggles for gender, racial, and social justice, while simultaneously acknowledging that these categories are neither fixed nor permanent. So this is complicated, and I'll come back to talking about this a little bit more. But we know that these identities can shift, and people can shift how they feel about themselves and how they wish to be identified. But for the purposes of trying to do an introductory course, it would be totally confusing, and actually you'd have trouble speaking if you couldn't make definitive statements to begin with and then begin to complicate it. And my last sentence is, for these reasons, feminism as defined here requires a radical reconstruction of human society. So as far as I know, no society that we have so far encountered as human beings, except, in my view, certain traditional indigenous cultures, certainly on the North American continent, have come close to trying to achieve this kind of equality. And everywhere you go in the world, you see these various forms of discrimination.